The Little Grey Man. A nun, a countryman, and a blacksmith. One day they lost their way in a thick, dark forest, and were thankful when they saw, in the distance, the walls of a house where they hoped they might obtain refuge for the night. When they got close to the house, they found that it was an old deserted castle, fast falling into ruins, but with some of the rooms in it still habitable. As they were homeless, they determined to take up their abode in the castle, and they arranged that one of them should always stay in the home and keep house, while the other two went into the world to seek their fortunes. The lot of remaining at home first fell to the nun. Where the countryman and blacksmith had gone out into the wood, she set to work, tidied up the house, and prepared all the food for the day. As her companions did not come home for their midday meal, she ate up all her own portion and put the rest in the oven to keep warm. Just as she was sitting down to sew, the door opened, and a little grey man came in, and standing before her, he said, "Oh, how cold I am!" The nun was very sorry for him, and said at once, "Sit down by the fire and warm yourself." A little man did as he was told, and soon called out, "Oh, how hungry I am!" The nun answered, "There's food in the oven. Help yourself." The little man did not need to be told twice, for he set to work and ate up everything with the greatest possible dispatch. When the nun saw this, she was very angry and scolded the dwarf because he had left nothing for her companions. The little man resented her words and flew into such a passion that he seized the nun, beat her, and threw her against one wall and then against the other. When he had nearly half killed her, he left her lying on the floor and hastily walked out of the house. In the evening, the countryman and the blacksmith returned home, and when they found, on demanding their dinner, that there was nothing left for them, they reproached the nun bitterly and refused to believe her that she had tried to tell them what had happened. The next day, the countryman asked to be left in charge of the house, and promised that, if he remained home, no one should go to bed hungry. So the other two went out into the forest, and the countryman, having prepared the food for the day, ate up his own portion and put the rest in the oven. Just as he had finished clearing away, the door opened, and the little grey man walked in, and this time he had two heads. He shook and trembled as before, and exclaimed, "Oh, how cold I am!" The countryman, who was frightened out of his wits, begged him to draw near the fire and to warm himself. Soon the dwarf looked greedily around and said, "Oh, how hungry I am!" "There's food in the oven. Eat what you want," replied the countryman. Then the little man fell in with both his heads and soon finished the last morsel. When the countryman scolded him for this proceeding, he treated him exactly as he did the nun, and left the poor fellow more dead than alive. Now, when the blacksmith came home with a nun in the evening, and found nothing for supper, he flew into a passion and swore that he would stay at home the following day, that no one should go supperless to bed. When the day dawned, the countryman and the nun set out into the woods, and the blacksmith prepared all the food for the day as the others had done. Again the grey dwarf entered the house, without knocking. This time he had 3 heads. When he complained about the cold, the blacksmith told him to sit near the fire, and when he said he was hungry, the blacksmith put some food on a plate and gave it to him. The dwarf made short work of what was provided to him, and then, looking greedily around with his 6 eyes, he demanded more. When the blacksmith refused to give him another morsel, he flew into a terrible rage and proceeded to treat him the same way he had treated his companions. But the blacksmith was a match for him, for he seized a huge hammer and struck off 2 of the dwarf's heads with it. The little man yelled with pain and rage and hastily fled from the house. The blacksmith ran after him, pursued him for a long way, but at last they came to an iron door. Through it the little creature had vanished. The door shut behind him, and the blacksmith had to give up pursuit and return home. They found that the nun and countryman had come back in the meantime, and they were much delighted when he placed some food before them, and he showed him the 2 heads he had struck off with his hammer. The 3 companions determined there was then and there to free themselves from the power of the grey dwarf, and the next day they set to work to find him. They had to walk a long way and to search for many hours before they found the iron door through which the dwarf had disappeared. And when they found it, they had the greatest difficulty in opening it. When at last they succeeded in forcing a lock, they entered a large hall in which sat a young and lovely girl working at a table. The moment she saw the nun, the blacksmith, and the countryman, she fell at her feet, thanking them with tears in her eyes for having set her free. She then told them that she was a king's daughter who had been shut up in the castle by a mighty magician. The day before, just about noon, she had suddenly felt the power over her disappear, and ever since that moment she had waited eagerly for the arrival of her deliverers. She went on to say that there was yet another princess shut up in the castle, who had also befallen under the might of the magician. They wandered through many halls and rooms, till at last they found the second princess, who was quite grateful at first, and thanked the 3 companions most warmly for having set her free. Then the princess told the rescuers that a great treasure lay hidden in the cellars of the castle, and that it was guarded by a fierce, terrible dog. Nothing daunted, they all went down below at once, and found the fierce animal mounting guard over a treasure the princesses had said. But one blow from the blacksmith's hammer soon made an end of the monster, and they found themselves in a vaulted chamber full of gold and silver and precious stones. Beside the treasure stood a young and handsome man, who advanced to meet them, and thanked the nun, the blacksmith, and the countryman for having freed him from a magic spell he was under. He told them that he was a king's son who had been banished to this castle by a wicked magician, and that he had changed into the 3-headed dwarf. When he lost 2 of his heads, the magic power of the princesses had been removed, and when the blacksmith had killed the horrible dog, then he too had been set free. To show his gratitude, he begged the 3 companions to divide the treasure between them, which they did, and there was so much of it that it took a very long time. The princesses, too, were so grateful to the rescuers that one married the blacksmith and the other the countryman. Then the prince claimed the nun as his bride, and they lived happily together until they died.